We need to support each other, lift each other up, because together we are unstoppable.
The morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows, catching the edges of the marble floor and reminding me of everything I used to think mattered. Status, comfort, the illusion of security. I used to wake up in silk sheets, surrounded by luxury that whispered promises of forever. Back then, I believed I had it all. But what no one tells you is how quickly everything can start to feel like a cage when your dreams no longer fit inside it. Every choice, every word, every move I made was measured against someone else's approval, until one day, I realized I didn't even recognize my own reflection anymore. That moment, the quiet one when you finally hear yourself again, is where everything begins to change. I wasn't looking for revenge or to prove anything. I just wanted to see what I could build with my own hands, my own will, and my own fire. It started slowly, almost invisibly, like a shadow that stretches across the floor before you realize the light is fading. At first, I told myself it was love, the way he wanted to take care of everything, the way he insisted I didn't need to worry about bills or business or decisions. You deserve to be comfortable, he'd say, and I believed him. Who wouldn't want to be adored, protected, and surrounded by ease? I thought it was security, not control. But over time, the boundaries began to shift. Little by little, my independence was traded for convenience, and I didn't even notice how much of myself I had surrendered until there was almost nothing left. In the beginning, I loved that my life looked perfect from the outside. Friends would visit and marvel at the way everything seemed effortless. Designer dresses hung in my closet, dinners were served without me lifting a finger, and every plan was already made. But beneath that gloss, I started to feel a quiet emptiness. I'd wake up and realize I didn't have a single thing to do that was truly mine. My schedule revolved around his world, his meetings, his clients, his parties. I was just an accessory to a life he built, and somehow I convinced myself that was enough. I smiled for photos, made polite conversation, and played the part. But every night, when the laughter faded and the house fell silent, I felt smaller. It's a strange thing how dependence creeps in. You start to measure your worth through someone else's success. When you have everything handed to you, it feels good for a while, until you realize the trade-off is your freedom. I began to notice how my opinions were gently dismissed, my ambitions brushed aside with a laugh. You don't need to work, he'd say. You have me, and for a time I accepted it. Because admitting I was unhappy would mean admitting I had built my life around someone else's idea of happiness. I wanted to believe I was lucky, but deep down, I knew luck wasn't supposed to feel this lonely. The turning point came in the smallest of moments. One afternoon, I wanted to buy a gift for an old friend. I reached for my purse and realized I didn't even have my own money. Everything was in his name. Every card, every account, every signature. I had been so wrapped in comfort that I hadn't noticed the invisible chains forming around me. It wasn't about the money itself. It was about what it represented. I had lost the ability to make decisions that were mine alone. That realization hit me like a cold wave. For the first time, I understood that luxury without freedom isn't a privilege, it's a prison dressed in gold. From that day, I started seeing everything differently. The same marble floors that once impressed me now felt cold and distant. The grand house echoed with silence, reminding me of all the things I had given up, my dreams, my curiosity, my independence. I remembered the woman I used to be before the wealth, the one who had ambitions, ideas, and energy that could fill a room. She felt like a stranger now, buried beneath layers of dependence and complacency. It was painful to admit how far I had drifted from her, but it was the truth I needed to face. There's a quiet humiliation in realizing you've built your identity around someone else's power. It's not that I was weak, it's that I was comfortable. Comfort can be seductive. It lulls you into thinking you're safe when really you're stagnant. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw someone polished but hollow. Someone who smiled because it was expected, not because it was real. And though I couldn't say it out loud yet, a fire was beginning to stir inside me. It was faint, but it was there, the desire to feel alive again, to create something that couldn't be taken away. I started to remember the things that once made me feel capable. Late nights spent sketching designs, writing ideas in notebooks, dreaming about a business that was truly mine. Those memories became my quiet rebellion. I didn't know how to break free yet, but I began to see that the cage I lived in was one I had helped build by believing comfort equaled happiness. The truth was simpler and harder. Happiness only lasts when it's built on your own foundation. I wanted to find that foundation again, even if it meant starting from nothing. Every luxurious detail around me, the diamonds, the vacations, the admiration from others, felt meaningless when I couldn't make a single choice without asking permission. That was the cruelest irony of all. I had everything except myself, and once you lose yourself, no amount of wealth can fill that void. That realization didn't come with shouting or dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, like a whisper I couldn't ignore anymore, a truth I had buried for too long. I had become someone who depended on others to define her worth, and I didn't want to live that way another day. The decision to reclaim my identity didn't come in one bold moment. It was built out of hundreds of small, silent choices that slowly gathered courage. I remember standing in front of the mirror one morning, staring at the reflection that no longer looked like me. My hair was perfect, my clothes expensive, my smile practiced, but behind my eyes was someone hollow, waiting to wake up. I didn't recognize the woman who had traded her voice for comfort. I realized that if I didn't start making decisions for myself, I'd spend the rest of my life as a guest in my own story. That thought terrified me more than any hardship ever could. At first, I didn't know where to begin. It's strange how, when you've been dependent for so long, even the smallest steps feel impossible. I started by reclaiming my mornings. Instead of waiting for the day to be planned for me, I got up early, made my own coffee, and sat in silence to think. It sounds so small, but it was the first time in years I had done something just for myself. I began writing again. Lists, ideas, dreams I had buried under years of luxury and obedience. I filled pages with plans I wasn't sure I could achieve, but they were mine, and that made them sacred. When I finally made the decision to rebuild my life from scratch, it wasn't out of anger or defiance, it was out of necessity. I needed to prove to myself that I could stand on my own, that I could live not as an accessory to someone else's power, but as the architect of my own. The first thing I did was open a small bank account in my name. It sounds trivial, but for me, it was revolutionary. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. I just wanted to know that something existed in the world that was completely mine. That small act of independence gave me a rush of confidence I hadn't felt in years. I began reconnecting with people I had lost touch with, old friends, former colleagues, anyone who reminded me of who I used to be. Those conversations felt like breathing again after being underwater for too long. Some people didn't recognize me anymore. They saw the polished version of me that my life had created. But the ones who looked closer could see the change, the quiet determination in my voice, the way I spoke about wanting to do something meaningful. One friend, in particular, told me something that stayed with me. You don't need permission to start over. You just need to start. That sentence became my mantra. I started looking for ways to use the skills I once had. I had always been creative, with an eye for design and a natural understanding of business, even if I'd been discouraged from using it. I spent nights researching, sketching, planning. I learned how to manage things on my own: finances, contracts, communication, things that had always been handled for me before. It was exhausting at first, but it was also liberating. Every mistake I made, every small victory I achieved, reminded me that I was capable. Of course, deciding to reclaim my life didn't come without fear. There were nights when I'd lie awake, wondering if I was making a mistake. The world I had lived in taught me that women like me didn't survive without someone powerful beside them. But I was starting to realize that power doesn't come from wealth or connections. It comes from the ability to trust yourself when no one else does. That realization became the foundation of everything I was building. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I also knew that staying the same was no longer an option. I began selling small pieces of jewelry I designed myself, using materials I could afford. It wasn't glamorous or profitable at first, but it was real. Each sale felt like a declaration of independence, a tiny victory over the version of myself who had once believed she couldn't survive alone. The first time someone bought my design and wore it proudly, I cried. It wasn't about the money. It was about seeing something that came from me, something tangible and meaningful. For the first time in years, I felt purpose flowing through my veins. The more I worked, the more alive I felt. My hands ached, my mind buzzed, but my spirit was on fire. I began to understand that reclaiming my identity wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving myself right. It was about remembering that the woman I once was had always been strong, capable, and resilient. She had just been buried beneath layers of comfort and control. Now she was back, and she was unstoppable. Every step forward brought new challenges, rejections, financial struggles, doubts, but they didn't scare me anymore. I had faced something far worse, the quiet death of my independence. Compared to that, failure didn't frighten me. What mattered most was that I was finally building a life that reflected who I truly was, not who someone else wanted me to be. Each day was another step toward freedom, another reminder that I could shape my own destiny, even if it meant starting from the ground up. When I finally decided to step out on my own, I thought the hardest part was over, that making the decision was the true test of courage. But I was wrong. The real challenge began the moment I walked away from the comfort of that controlled, glittering world and faced the silence that followed. There was no plan waiting for me, no safety net, no one to tell me what came next. The air outside that life felt different, colder, heavier, real. For the first time in years, I had to depend entirely on myself, and that realization was both empowering and terrifying. The first few weeks were the hardest. I had grown so used to having everything arranged for me that I didn't even know where to begin. Simple things, paying bills, managing expenses, planning meals, felt like foreign tasks. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city, far from the glossy neighborhoods I once called home. The walls were bare, the furniture mismatched, and the silence was loud. But there was freedom in that emptiness, even if it came with fear. I'd look around the tiny space and remind myself that every inch of it was mine. It wasn't much, but it was honest. Financially, it was a battle from day one. The savings I had managed to secure weren't enough to live comfortably, and every dollar had to be stretched. I learned quickly that starting over wasn't just about emotional strength, it was about survival. There were nights I skipped dinner so I could pay for materials for my small jewelry business. I'd sit on the floor, surrounded by beads, wires, and sketches, trying to create something that might sell. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. But I refused to give up. Each failed attempt was a lesson, each small success a spark of hope. Emotionally, the isolation was brutal. I went from being surrounded by people every day, maids, drivers, party guests, to sitting alone in a quiet room with no one to talk to. Some of the friends I thought I had disappeared the moment I was no longer part of that wealthy world. Invitations stopped coming. My phone barely rang. It hurt more than I wanted to admit, but it also showed me who truly cared and who only cared about proximity to power. That kind of truth is painful, but it's also purifying. I learned to be my own company, to find peace in my own thoughts instead of drowning them in luxury. There were moments when doubt crept in, whispering that maybe I had made a mistake. When you're exhausted and broke, it's easy to romanticize the past, to think about how much easier life was when everything was provided for you. But then I'd remind myself of the emptiness that came with that ease, the quiet suffocation of being controlled. Freedom, I realized, isn't comfortable. It's messy, uncertain, and often painful. But it's real, and that made every struggle worth it. Socially, the world didn't make it easy either. People looked at me differently once they realized I was no longer someone's wife but just a woman trying to make it on her own. Some pitied me, others judged me. There were whispers about how I had fallen from a privileged life. I stopped attending gatherings where I felt like a shadow of who I used to be. Instead, I focused on finding new circles, people who valued ambition, resilience, and authenticity more than appearances. It took time, but eventually, I found a few kindred souls who didn't care where I came from, only where I was going. Failure became a constant companion, but I learned to see it differently. I failed at marketing my products. I failed at negotiating deals. I failed at managing time. But every failure was a teacher, sharper and wiser than any comfort I had ever known. I began to respect the process, the long nights, the frustration, the endless revisions. I discovered strength in persistence, in waking up every morning and choosing to keep going even when everything seemed impossible. Slowly, progress began to show itself in small ways. My jewelry design started gaining attention online, orders trickled in, people appreciated the craftsmanship, the personal touch, the story behind each piece. I would package each order myself, tying the ribbon carefully, knowing that this was more than just business. It was a symbol of my independence. Each sale, no matter how small, felt like a victory against the version of me who had once believed she couldn't survive alone. Emotionally, I was growing stronger too. The loneliness that once haunted me began to turn into solitude, a kind of peace that comes when you realize you no longer need validation from anyone else. I started trusting my instincts again. The same intuition I had once silenced was now guiding me through every decision. I was learning not just how to survive, but how to live on my own terms. There were still moments of exhaustion when I'd stare at the ceiling and wonder how much longer I could keep going. But those moments never lasted. Because beneath all the fear and fatigue, there was a quiet pride building inside me. I was doing it. I was living, working, creating, failing, and trying again, all by myself. Every obstacle I faced became a reminder that I was no longer defined by someone else's wealth or approval. I was defined by my determination to rebuild, no matter how long it took or how hard it became. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers quietly in the back of your mind when everything else is falling apart. For me, discovering inner strength wasn't a sudden awakening. It was a slow, painful process built through failure, frustration, and the stubborn refusal to give up. There were days when I felt invisible, when my efforts seemed meaningless, and the weight of trying to rebuild from nothing pressed down so hard it was difficult to breathe. But even in those moments, there was a small, persistent voice inside me that said, "Keep going." That voice became my anchor, my guide through the storm. In the early stages of building something new, I made mistake after mistake. I invested in the wrong materials, trusted the wrong people, and overestimated what I could handle. Each setback felt like a personal failure, a confirmation of every doubt I'd ever been fed about not being strong enough to survive on my own. I'd sit at my small desk surrounded by receipts, sketches, and bills, feeling the weight of exhaustion crush my spirit. But after every breakdown, there was a quiet moment where I realized no one was coming to save me, and somehow that truth made me stronger. Because once you stop waiting for someone else to rescue you, you begin to understand the depth of your own resilience. I learned to see failure differently. Instead of viewing it as a dead end, I started treating it as a lesson even when it stung. The first time one of my product launches failed, I cried for hours. I had worked tirelessly, believing it would be my big breakthrough, but instead, it flopped. I could have quit then. No one would have blamed me. But something inside me refused to let that be the end. I went back to the drawing board, analyzed every mistake, and forced myself to try again. The second time wasn't perfect, but it was better. Each attempt after that grew stronger because I was learning, adapting, evolving. My strength wasn't in avoiding failure. It was in facing it head on and choosing to stand up every single time. There were also emotional battles that no one saw. The loneliness, the self-doubt, the fear of being judged or misunderstood. I would look at my reflection and question whether I was delusional to believe I could create something out of nothing. But then I'd remember all the times I had been told I couldn't live without someone else's support, and it would ignite something fierce in me. I refused to let that prophecy define me. Every small victory, a positive review, a repeat customer, a kind message from a stranger, became fuel for my determination. Slowly, I began to rebuild not just my business, but my confidence, my self-belief, and my sense of purpose. There was power in realizing that strength isn't about being unbreakable. It's about being able to rebuild yourself every time life knocks you down. I learned to celebrate progress instead of perfection. I learned to rest without quitting. I learned that sometimes strength looks like showing up when you don't feel ready. On nights when the exhaustion was too much, I'd remind myself of how far I'd come. From a woman who once doubted her worth to someone who was building something meaningful with her own two hands. That reminder became my light in the darkest moments. Through persistence, I started to find rhythm in the chaos. My small business began to grow, not rapidly, but steadily. Each month brought a little more stability, a few more customers, and a lot more confidence. The strength I was developing wasn't loud or showy. It was quiet, rooted in experience, built on the foundation of my struggles. I realized I didn't need to be fearless. I just needed to keep going despite the fear. Every challenge that once seemed impossible became manageable because I had faced worse and survived. Even my relationship with failure changed completely. I began to appreciate it as a companion rather than an enemy. Failure was honest, it revealed my weaknesses, forced me to grow, and humbled me in ways success never could. It taught me patience, resilience, and humility. I learned that persistence isn't about ignoring pain, it's about enduring it and still finding meaning through it. I stopped measuring my worth by how fast I was succeeding and started measuring it by how courageously I was trying. That shift in mindset transformed everything. Eventually, I began to notice how my inner strength was shaping not only my work, but my outlook on life. I no longer felt the need to seek validation from others. The pride I felt came from within. From knowing that I had built something real, something entirely mine. There was no longer a need to prove anything to anyone. Just the quiet satisfaction of living authentically, guided by resilience and self-trust. Even on the hardest days, when things didn't go as planned and exhaustion clawed at me, I found comfort in how far I'd come. I could now stand in the middle of my small workshop, surrounded by the tools of my new life, and feel proud, not because everything was perfect, but because I had built it from the ground up. My failures hadn't broken me, they had forged me into someone stronger, wiser, and more grounded than I had ever been before. Building my own business was nothing like I had imagined. It wasn't glamorous or fast-paced. It was slow, uncertain, and filled with moments that tested every part of me. When I started, I had little more than a notebook full of ideas, a handful of saved money, and the quiet determination to create something meaningful. I didn't want to just survive anymore. I wanted to build an empire that carried my name, my vision, and my story. I wanted it to be proof that strength and success don't come from wealth or connections but from persistence, creativity, and belief in yourself when no one else does. I began by focusing on what I knew best, design. Jewelry had always fascinated me, not just as an accessory but as an expression of identity. I wanted to create pieces that told stories, that made people feel seen and empowered. I started small, handcrafting each piece at my kitchen table. The early days were exhausting. I worked long hours, balancing multiple roles, designer, marketer, accountant, and customer service all in one. There were nights when I fell asleep surrounded by scattered sketches and tangled wires, my fingers sore and my mind heavy with doubt. But every morning, I'd wake up and start again, driven by something deeper than ambition. At first, hardly anyone noticed what I was doing. My online store barely made sales, and I had to rely on local markets to get my work seen. I'd set up a small table at fairs and exhibitions, standing for hours behind my modest display, trying to catch the attention of passers-by. Many would glance at my pieces, compliment them politely, and move on. But once in a while, someone would stop, pick up a necklace, and ask about its story. Those conversations became my fuel. I realized that people weren't just buying jewelry, they were connecting with meaning. They wanted something personal, something real. That realization shaped my entire brand. I started infusing my designs with messages of resilience and empowerment. Each piece had a story, a symbol of independence, rebirth, or courage. I wrote about my journey anonymously through blog posts and social media, sharing the lessons I learned from failure and growth. The response was slow but steady. People began to resonate with the honesty behind my work. Orders started to increase, and for the first time, I felt the momentum shifting. I wasn't just making jewelry anymore. I was building something far bigger than I had imagined. As my business grew, I faced new challenges. Managing production, keeping up with demand, handling finances. It all required skills I was still learning. There were moments of panic when shipments went wrong, when materials didn't arrive on time, or when I couldn't afford to hire help. But each obstacle became another test of how badly I wanted this dream to succeed. I learned to negotiate with suppliers, manage inventory, and handle customers with professionalism and grace. I learned to trust my instincts, even when logic told me to give up. Every problem I solved made me stronger. Every success reminded me why I started. One of the biggest turning points came when a popular lifestyle blogger discovered my brand and shared it online. Overnight, my website traffic exploded. Orders poured in from across the country. I stayed up for 3 days straight packaging products, answering messages, and organizing shipments. It was chaotic, overwhelming, and exhilarating all at once. That moment marked the beginning of my transition from a small home business to a growing brand. But even then, I promised myself I would never lose sight of why I started, to create something with meaning, built from resilience and self-belief. I expanded slowly, deliberately. I rented a small studio space, hired 2 assistants, and began planning new collections. Each step forward felt like reclaiming another piece of the independence I had once lost. I could finally make decisions without fear, lead with confidence, and watch my ideas come to life. People began to associate my brand with authenticity and strength. I was no longer just selling jewelry, I was selling the story of transformation, of a woman who refused to be defined by what she had lost, and instead focused on what she could create. As my business gained recognition, so did I. Interviews, collaborations, and partnerships followed. Yet even as my name started to appear in magazines and online articles, I stayed grounded. Success hadn't come overnight. It had been earned, piece by piece, through years of struggle and perseverance. I took pride not just in what I had achieved, but in the woman I had become through the process. Every sleepless night, every setback, every tear shed over failure had shaped me into someone capable, confident, and unbreakable. What I built wasn't just a company, it was a symbol of freedom. My empire didn't come from inheritance or marriage. It came from hard work, sacrifice, and the refusal to settle for less than I deserved. I learned that wealth built by your own hands feels different. It carries pride, not dependency. I began mentoring other women who wanted to start over, sharing what I had learned about strength and self-reliance. Watching them find their footing reminded me of my own journey, of the power that comes when you stop asking for permission and start creating your own path. The empire I built wasn't made of marble or gold, it was made of resilience, sweat, and faith in myself. Every product that left my studio was more than a sale. It was a reminder that I had taken the pieces of my old life and turned them into something extraordinary. When I finally reached the point where I could look back on everything I had built, it didn't feel like triumph in the way people imagine. It wasn't about revenge or proving anyone wrong, it was about peace. The kind of peace that comes when you know you've walked through fire and come out stronger, not burned. I had started with nothing but determination, and now I stood surrounded by the life I had created from scratch. My business had grown beyond my wildest dreams, not because of luck or connections, but because I refused to stop when it would have been easier to give up. What I built was more than a brand. It was a reflection of who I had become. The woman I used to be would never have believed this was possible. She thought strength came from being protected, that love meant dependence, that security meant surrendering control. But now I knew better. Real strength wasn't loud or showy. It was quiet, consistent, and deeply rooted in self-belief. I had faced loneliness, financial hardship, exhaustion, and doubt. Yet somehow, each obstacle had shaped me into a version of myself I admired. There was no longer a need to seek validation from anyone else. I no longer needed to prove that I could live without someone. I was living proof that I could thrive entirely on my own. There came a day when I crossed paths with people from my old life. Those who had once pitied me or looked at me as if I had fallen from grace. Their faces carried that familiar blend of surprise and curiosity. They asked questions about my business, about how I was doing, and I could see the disbelief behind their polite smiles. They had expected me to fade quietly, to struggle endlessly, to come crawling back for comfort. But there I stood, composed and confident, wearing success that no one could take away. The power I now carried didn't come from luxury or status. It came from knowing that every step of my journey had been mine alone. What surprised me most wasn't their reaction, but my own. I didn't feel anger or pride, I felt calm. I had no desire to prove them wrong anymore. Their opinions no longer had weight in my world, because I had outgrown the need for approval. I had learned that true freedom comes not when others recognize your worth, but when you stop needing them to. The independence I once feared had become my greatest source of joy. Every morning I woke up with purpose, not because someone handed it to me, but because I created it myself. My empire wasn't just financial, it was emotional, spiritual, and personal. I had rebuilt not only my career but my sense of identity. I surrounded myself with people who valued authenticity over appearances, collaboration over competition. My team grew, made up of women who had their own stories of struggle and rebirth. Together we built something sustainable, something meaningful. I wanted my success to serve as a reminder that women could start over at any point in life, that losing everything isn't the end, it's the beginning of becoming who you were meant to be. I started giving talks, sharing my journey with others who felt stuck in situations that mirrored my past. Every time I spoke, I saw a spark in someone's eyes, a spark I once lost and had to fight to reignite. Telling my story wasn't about fame or sympathy, it was about reminding others that strength lives in all of us, waiting to be discovered. I watched other women begin to take control of their lives, inspired to create their own paths. It became one of the most rewarding parts of everything I'd accomplished. But it wasn't always smooth. Success came with new responsibilities, new pressures. There were moments when I felt that old fear creeping back in, the fear of losing control, the fear of being alone in the struggle. Yet this time, I knew how to handle it. I had learned that failure wasn't something to run from, it was something to learn from. I had fallen before, and I had rebuilt myself, so I knew I could do it again if I ever had to. That knowledge gave me a sense of power that no amount of money or prestige could replace. The freedom I felt now was indescribable. I could choose my path, my goals, my pace. I could say no without guilt, make decisions without fear, and dream without limits. Everything I had once been told I couldn't do, I had done, and more. I no longer needed the approval of a husband, society, or anyone else to validate my worth. My life was no longer defined by what I had lost but by what I had created. Standing in my studio one evening, surrounded by the products of years of hard work, I realized how far I had come. The space was filled with laughter, ideas, and purpose. Everything I had once longed for. It wasn't just a business, it was a home built from resilience and vision. I remembered the girl who once felt small and powerless in a mansion, and smiled at the woman I had become, a woman who owned her story, her success, and her freedom completely. My story isn't about revenge or proving someone wrong, it's about rediscovering who I was always meant to be. I learned that real power doesn't come from wealth, luxury, or someone else's approval. It comes from standing on your own feet after losing everything. Every setback, every sleepless night, every tear became a brick in the foundation of the life I built with my own hands. I went from being dependent to being unstoppable, from silent to self-assured, from comfortable to courageous. What I created wasn't just a business. It was a declaration of independence, a reminder that no one defines your worth but you. I didn't just build an empire, I built myself. And now when I look around at everything I've achieved, I see proof that even when the world doubts you, believing in yourself can turn loss into legacy.